Let's call this meeting to order. Seems like it's time. And we can call this meeting to order and opening remarks. Is there any opening remarks from, I guess Chairman Benoit can't speak, right? Because he could only listen because it wasn't advised.
That's correct. So let me see, are there any members here that have any opening remarks? There are none here.
None?
None.
Okay. Then moving forward, approval of February 8th, 2019 meeting minutes. How do we do that if there aren't any other members? Can we just get a motion from the floor from folks there around the table?
Motion to approve.
There's a
First. Is there a second?
Paul Avila seconds.
Is there anybody in opposition? Thank you. Seeing none. Minutes are approved. Review of follow-up action items.
Sure.
Mr. Latorre?
Yes, sir. So a couple action items. One was there was a request for staff to update this committee on the voter district authorization bill. That's going to happen today. And then the other action item was last year request was made for all three AB 617 steering committee rosters be sent to the board member or to the committee members here. That was staff emailed the rosters on March the 1st. And then That's it.
Are there any questions from folks around the table on any of those items?
Yeah, yes, Supervisor. I have a question of Derek. Recently,
Go ahead.
Recently, there was an item about attendance at working group meetings. That was, I guess, more focused at the EJ committee. But does that? My question is, does that apply to all the working groups?
So right now, no, it does not. But it was brought up by Dr. Liu that that should be for all of the advisory groups. So that action hasn't been taken for all advisory groups, but just for the two that you mentioned.
Any other questions? Thank you. Moving forward, item number 4, discussion items. Update on matters B. Andrea Polidori.
So today I'll give you an update on our MATES multiple layer toxic exposure study, the 5th chapter of this program. So as you know already, the MATES program is basically it's a study that has been conducted by the South Coast for quite a long time. MATES 1 was actually in the mid-80s, and the main purpose is to study regional air toxic impacts in the basin. And so the main goal and objectives are to provide the public with information on air toxic risk, to evaluate the progress in reducing air toxic exposure in the basin, and also provide direction to future toxic control programs. So in a nutshell, what we have seen going from MATES 3 to MATES 4, so going more or less from 2005 to 2012-13, is that the cancer risk has decreased by more than 50%. And the major contributor to cancer risk in the basin is by far exposure to diesel particulate matter. And so one of the things that we're very curious about seeing in MATES 5 is if there has been further decrease in diesel particulate matter emission and exposure in the basin. So in terms of MATES 5, there are two components to this particular part of the study. So there's fixed monitoring and there's advanced refinery monitoring. For the fixed monitoring, I mean, essentially, throughout the years, we have been collecting air toxic information at the same 10 fixed sites. So that's how we are able to track the progress in terms of air toxic reduction. And the information collected at the fixed sites will also help inform emission inventories and the modeling for health risk. So every maze has some sort of advanced monitoring. During maze 4, we're specific monitoring for ultrafine particle from combustion sources and for black carbon, which is an indicator of diesel particulate matter. The special interest for maze 5 is more advanced monitoring at refineries. And so we will conduct flight-based measurements, mobile monitoring, and we also work with refineries to better characterize potential emissions from their facilities. And I'll tell you more about the advanced monitoring in a few minutes. So in terms of fixed monitoring sites, this is a map that shows that basically, for the most part, the 10 station, again, going from maze 4 to maze 5 have not changed. The only exception is the Burbank location. We couldn't get access on time, so we decided to go slightly north at the Whiteman Airport. There we conduct integrated and continuous measurement for particle and gaseous pollutants, a wide array of air toxics, including ultrafine particle and black carbon. We started monitoring in January of 2018. And all of the stations were online in April of 18, and therefore, we'll end monitoring at those locations in April of this year. So we are almost done at the 10 fixed sites. And as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of data that is being produced and analyzed by the lab. So the preliminary data from all of the monitoring and analysis of the samples will be available soon. In terms of refinery monitoring, this is essentially the concept. We will work with one refinery to conduct aerial measurements from above to try to characterize not just emission from refinery, but from other potential sources of VOCs and of air toxics. And we'll conduct mobile measurements using what we call, it's a mobile platform that measures VOCs using state-of-the-art technology that not many people have. And we'll conduct fence line monitoring, and we'll also try to work with the community to build a sensor network to engage and educate the community in the use of operation of these low-cost sensors. So just to tell you a little more about the flight measurements, this is a contract that we have with a company called Aerospace. They are local, they are here in Los Angeles, and they mostly take care of defense type of contracts. The technology they have is quite amazing because, from the sky, they can, essentially scan, I think they can do 20 square kilometers per minute with a space resolution of about 2 meters. It's kind of incredible technology they classified about 10 years ago. And they can really, survey the entire basin in a couple of days and tell you, which facilities and which area are most likely to emit, VOCs and other sources of air toxics, mostly for gases, so mostly VOCs. So what we started to do with them, they have historical data that they have collected in the business since 2010. So they gave us more than 10 terabytes worth of data. It's a lot, believe me. And so we are working to try to see if this historical information can provide, can give us a good idea of where the major hotspots of VOCs are in the basin. So the analysis is currently ongoing. In terms of mobile measurements, we already started doing some mobile survey around the refinery and in nearby communities a couple of years ago through some other program. But in April of this year, we will get our own van. It's called FluxSense van because that's the company that is putting it together for us. But this is quite incredible technology also because it allows you to quickly survey communities and refineries to try to figure out the sources of emissions, if there are leaking tanks, if there are leaking part of the refinery, and the potential impacts on downwind communities. Just to give you an example of this is one of the many measurements we have done, and this mobile type of technology is very good for assessing impacts or refinery emission on nearby communities. If you can tell from the picture, if there is wind coming from the west in this case, and there is a leaking tank, we are very, very likely to find what the contribution in the downwind community might be. Oh yes, sorry.
Andrea, I have a question for you, and I'm going to throw you a curveball.
Yep.
Let's say pre-drought, prior to when the drought started, and now I like to call it post-drought.
Yeah.
So the past 2 years with heavy rains, especially there's more rain coming. So let's suppose you took a sample from all your stations, okay, after the heavy rain, okay. Now let's go back 6 months ago when it was hot and dusty.
Right.
Is there a correlation between the two as far as your numbers would change?
When it rains, it's very likely that the concentration of the particulate pollutants is fairly low, just because you find clean conditions. It might also impact, the concentration of some of the gaseous pollutants, but generally speaking, whenever it rains, you have kind of cleaner type of air quality conditions. Yeah, that's to be expected every year, right? So during, kind of the winter months, January, February.
So let's say
That's the
that
case.
we have another month of wetness, okay?
Right.
I mean, we need it too, I mean, no complaints.
Right.
Now, how bad would that skewer your measurements?
I don't think if this year is unusually rainy, I don't think that is going to have like a significant impact on the overall emission for the season even. So, it's always, this type of episode is something that we keep into account, but overall in the kind of big scheme of things, they don't really impact the magnitude of the air pollution levels that we measure. Yeah. Sure.
Thank you for your report. Just a question on the raw data. Is that available?
The raw data, not yet. I mean, for MATES 5, first, we have not finished the collection of the samples, of the data, of that information yet, and it's going to take quite a bit of time just to analyze the data. Once we publish the report, all of the information will be made available. But also, just for your information, some of these continuous measurements, I mean, they're measured at 1 second time resolution. One of the most difficult parts is to be able to go from raw data to something that makes sense, that we can interpret, right? So it's I'm more than happy to give
Agreed.
you all of the data that we have, but the difficulty is in trying to interpret them correctly.
So as a retired truck driver, I have difficulty defining what a 50% decrease in cancer risk, what is the relationship to the raw data?
Well, for the most part, diesel particulate matter, we measure diesel particulate matter using what is called black carbon measurements. So black carbon is used as a surrogate for diesel emissions. So, black carbon is measured at different locations. We have instruments that measure black carbon, I believe, every minute. So there is a direct correlation between a decrease in black carbon concentration, a decrease in diesel particulate matter, and therefore a decrease in exposure and in cancer risk as well.
So if I could just say, can we, is it okay with Supervisor Perez and others if we just finish the presentation, then we do the questions afterwards, so we can just get through it and have all.
Yeah, I can't, just so everyone knows, I can't see if there's questions or someone raise their hand, because what I see on the screen right here is the presentation. So Mr. Latorre or Polidori, if you want to, take questions or not, it's up to you. But I just want to let you know that I can't see from here, so it's hard for me to chair the conversation. So maybe perhaps we just have the presentation, and then afterwards we can go to questions if that makes things easier for people.
That's great, thank you.
All right, thank you. So next slide, one of the programs that we have here at the South Coast SCAQMD is called AQSPEC, Air Quality Sensor Performance Evaluation Center. So we have been doing quite a lot of work with this low-cost sensor technology for measuring air pollution. And one of the things that we are doing in collaboration with a company that is called Aclima is to deploy some of these low-cost sensors in different areas of the basin. We are focusing for the most part the area where all of the refineries are located, so Wilmington and Carson for the most part. But long story short, we are essentially deploying several low-cost sensors for measuring particulate matter, so PM 2.5, but also coarse particulate matter. and NO and CO that are indication of combustion activities. And soon enough, we'll also have some experimental sensors for measuring VOCs, volatile organic compounds. This is, I mean, as you can imagine, low-cost sensors in this case, each box cost about, $1,500. They are not as accurate as the equipment that we have, the one that I was showing to you before that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there is a difference in the type of information that you get from the sensors. But the usefulness is that we can engage the community in the process. We are working with communities to try to kind of engage them and educate them in the use and operation of this type of technology. So it's a very successful and very useful program nonetheless. What is next? In terms of fixed site monitoring, just to recap, the last date of measurements at the 10 fixed sites will be April of 2019. So we are almost down there. As I said, the analysis of the data is already in progress, but it's going to take us, I don't know, several weeks at least, if not more, to properly validate the data, analyze the data, interpret the data, and then, of course, it takes even longer to write a report. In terms of advanced monitoring, for the aerospace flight-based measurements, we have scheduled tentatively the new set of flights for the summer of 2019. As I mentioned before, the analysis of the historical data is already in progress. For the FluxSense mobile laboratory type of measurements, we'll get the van in April of 2019. Also very important because this van will be used extensively for other programs, including AB617. We are conducting a project with UCLA. I should have described this properly earlier. But essentially, we are trying to build what is called an optical tent. And we are working with one of the refineries to install very sophisticated optical remote sensing instruments at an elevated, at about like 50 feet. The exact altitude is to be established. But essentially what this instrument does is scans the facility from the top, left and right, horizontally, to try to identify potential sources of emission, such as tanks, leaking pipes, and all of that. So we have finally found, hopefully, an agreement with one of the refineries to do the installation of this equipment, and that type of instrumentation will be online, hopefully, in the next few months. And then, let's see, in terms of sensor work, as I said, we deploy several local sensors in the Carson, Wilmington, and part of Long Beach. And about 36 of these sensors have been operating for 3 or more months now. But again, the main purpose is to able to engage the local communities in this whole air monitoring process. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.
So we'll open up to questions. Why don't we start with Bill, because I know, Bill, you had a question before I change the rule here.
Yeah, thank you. I was looking at your slide on the MATES progression.
Yeah.
And fascinated to see that you have a 50% cancer risk reduction between MATES 3 and MATES 4, and I certainly look forward to what MATES 5 has to reveal. But looking at your 10 monitoring stations, the way that they're placed throughout the basin, is there a way for you to attribute the risks? Cancer risk reduction throughout the entire South Coast Basin is fine, but can you attribute that to particular sources like heavy-duty trucks, gasoline dispensing stations, ships in the port, and so on?
Right. So, you're exactly right. I think, the main purpose is to be able to identify and characterize regional cancer risk, so to speak, right? But sometimes it happens that, if there is an anomaly in the data, that sometimes it leads to identify specific sources of emission. During MATES 3, I think at the Rubidoux station inland, we measured very unusually high concentration of Chrome 6. And so that led to an investigation that lasts for quite a while, and all of the indication pointed it towards like Cal Portland, and that's how we started the investigation of Chrome 6 emission at Cal Portland. So it's not unusual to identify specific sources of emission, but given the location of this monitoring station, for the most part, they are only indicative of regional air toxic measurements.
So I guess your answer is probably not. You can't do a source attribution then. I remember this Chrome 6 discovery out
Right.
there. I think the ultimate answer to that was clinker that was brought into the basin.
Correct,
It was
right.
taken from outside the basin, transported in.
That's correct.
So it didn't occur here. So.
Right. And just also to clarify your question, for example, for air monitoring stations in the Hudson and Long Beach area, I mean there is maybe a more direct correlation with diesel traffic coming from the port and going inland. So you can get kind of an idea of how the different sources of pollutions are evolving. And then, I mean, of course, we have a whole different modeling component that takes monitoring into account, emission inventory into account, and other information, and is trying to put it all together into a model to explain, more specific sources such as, traffic and diesel PM.
And my second question, on your slide on the sensor networks and community engagement, these low-cost sensors, admittedly, they're less reliable than your, I guess, higher price sensors. You get what you pay for, I guess, with anything. Will that information, will that data find its way into MATES 5? And if so, are you afraid that it might corrupt the otherwise valid data that you have from the more scientific sensors?
Now that's also a very good question. I think that the main advantage of having a sensor network is that you can rely on having a high number of data points spread out through a wider area, right? So if you have, let's say, this room, right, you have one very accurate EPA-approved instrumentation right in the center. It tells you that the measurement you take there are very accurate, very precise, very reliable, but you don't know what's going on everywhere else. But now if you have a very accurate instrument right in the middle and you have sensors spread out all over the place, at the very least, you can tell something more about the spatial distribution of the pollution, temporal distribution of the pollution. So I think, the key is to be able to extract the right amount of information from the sensors and keeping their limitation in mind, try to basically, appropriately interpret the data. So the accuracy is definitely lower. They are not EPA approved. They cannot be used for compliance action. But at the same time, I like them very much just because they give you a lot more information about the spatial and temporal distribution. So yeah.
Go with, you don't mind if we go with Rita first, too? Okay, go ahead, David, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It's very helpful.
Sure.
Two questions. One is just the overall comparison from year to year for the percent reduction in risk. Is that comparing that using one methodology? We have OHIA has changed the methodology for how to calculate risk. Are we using that current methodology and then just going backwards saying the percent change is relative to the new methodology?
So from the methodology didn't change from MATES 3 to MATES 4. I'm not, I would defer to the health effects officer for a more accurate answer, but I know that the methodology is changing. So I think that will be taken into account, before we basically provide updated information. But
And maybe the way to say it is, do you go to the MATES 3 report and say,
going backwards.
Here's the concentration versus here's the risk, and then compare it to the risks today?
Okay.
It is apples to apples. Yeah. Thank you. And then the other questions, parallel to what you're discussing with Bill, is for the additional sensors, you have kind of non-traditional locations that may have, not as accurate results. when you look at that, it helps identify certain areas and identify the spatial distribution. My question is, when you go and look at the overall risk in the basin, how do you take that data and then say what is representative of the concentrations in the basin? Do you count those concentrations when you look at the risk, or do you just sort of set it aside and say that's more of a litmus test of where the pollution's coming from?
Yeah, no, the sensor information will not be taken into account into the cancer risk calculations.
There's more of
That-
an identification process.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Go ahead, Rita.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. On your slide that's titled MATES Progression, you have a note that diesel particulate matter accounted for 2/3 of the air toxics cancer risk. So for the remaining 1/3, and I understand you're using the black carbon as a tracer for the particulate matter. So for the remaining 1/3, do you have a sense of what those contaminants are? And is the monitoring able to pick it up, the specific contaminants, the toxics?
Right. For the most part, there are metals, volatile organic compounds, carbonyls. So we do have, specific information about the concentration of the remaining air toxics too. Yeah.
Hello, thanks for your presentation. You had referred to the work at AB 617, and aside from the van, is there any other integration, any other work that you're doing with the project?
So with respect to MATES 5, some of the, there's definitely an overlap, especially in the Wilmington area, right? So some of the work we are conducting there within MATES 5 will be used also to make an assessment about, potential sources of pollution that will be taken into account, within AB 617. So, the FluxSense van is definitely, kind of our flagship when it comes to, advanced technology for monitoring air toxics. And we have a lot more strategies and technologies, that we are either purchasing or adapting, specifically for AB 617. I can tell you more for sure if you're interested. Yeah, sure.
Any other questions? Supervisor, no other questions over here. You're on mute, Supervisor.
Sorry about that. Thank you once again for the presentation, and as well, thank you to all of you that are there around the table for your questions. Moving on, discussion item number 5, voting district authorization bill for clean air. Philip Crabb.
Yes. Hello, good afternoon. I will be going ahead and providing an update on our sponsored bill regarding the voting district authorization for clean air. So I'll start off providing a little bit of background and need for the bill. I know you guys are familiar with a lot of those things, obviously, but of course, we have the worst air quality in the nation and affecting the health of our 17 million folks that are in the region. We're in extreme non-attainment for ozone under the federal law, and we've still not attained for ambient PM 2.5 standards. And of course, over 80% of the regional NOx emissions are coming from mobile sources, but unfortunately, we don't have that primary authority to regulate the mobile sources. We're just focused on stationary, and those mobile sources are regulated more by CARB and US EPA, depending on what types of vehicles and what type of situation it is. Of course, with the ports, over 40% of the goods, imported container goods, come through our area and go directly to the rest of the country. And it's a huge economic engine for the region that we want to preserve, but of course it's a great source of pollution that we need to address. Now, as we're required to do the AQMP to address all the stationary and the mobile sources, that's something that is part of what we need to do. And as you all know, in the last AQMP, we kind of replaced the black box with the green box, which is more over $1 billion a year in incentives going both to private and public in order to turn over the dirty fleets, all the different vehicles, things like that, into the cleaner fleets so that we could have goods movement, transit, all those kinds of things, but done in a cleaner way. And unfortunately, regulation cannot be adopted and implemented fast enough in order for us to address this, simply because it takes time. Those things are usually phased in, but we're dealing with federal deadlines that are coming up very soon It's 2019, our first deadline is 2023, and that requires a 45% reduction of NOx levels. The next one is 2031 with a 55% reduction of NOx emissions. And we're looking towards a new standard coming out based on the 2015 federal ozone standard that would likely be taking effect in 2038. So that's something that's not in our current AQMP, but we have to look down the line to anticipate additional reductions that are needed. Now, of course, the key message here is that if we don't meet those standards, don't meet those deadlines, then we're going to be basically facing a severe threat of federal sanctions. And that's usually what happens if you're not meeting your standards. That means the potential for cutoff of billions of dollars in transportation funding. I've heard estimates of $6 to $8 billion a year is possible. Also, stricter permitting requirements for business in terms of what their offset emissions for new businesses coming into the area, and also a possible federal takeover of air quality management, which could result in severe air quality measures hurtful to the economy and business, like no drive days, or certain businesses need to be closed during certain times, basically just for the focus of reducing emissions. So given the great funding need and the specter of federal sanctions hanging over the region, we've continued to look at all options in terms of generating the funding needed for incentives. And that includes things like greenhouse gas, the greenhouse GGRF funds. We've been aggressively over the last couple of years getting over $100 million in types of incentive funding to do just that. We ran another bill, AB 1274, that enhanced kind of diverted some small check fees towards the Carl Moyer program to, again, increase more incentive type funding. Of course, we're working at the federal level, so we're doing all we can and staying aggressive at all levels. Now, this particular bill created a new opportunity. Cities, counties, other entities have the authority to place funding measures on the ballot, but no such power exists within the South Coast Air District or any air district, either to place the measure through an initiative or through the board. So this bill basically provides that opportunity, establishes a voting area, and there's a lot of logistics involved in that, the elections officer and all those types of things that would go, but it focuses it within the region that is defined by the South Coast District. This also gives, if, for example, a voter initiative by the people were to be put on a ballot, it would give the people the opportunity to vote to decide whether or not they want to invest in clean air. And also there's climate change benefits as well. So one thing I'd like to also mention about if you were to have any future funding measures that would come through, the key is what would that money be used for? What would be the benefits of it? So of course, if you were to fully implement our air quality management plan, which is obviously a very detailed plan that's been approved by CARB and by US EPA, you would have two major great benefits. And one would be we would be able to meet the federal attainment and basically eliminate unhealthy air pollution within South Coast District with regard to federal standards. And, obviously that would be something that we've been striving for decades. So having a possible actual solution to achieve that is a pretty big deal. The other thing is that it would actually eliminate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% below 1990 levels by the 2015 state goal. So basically our region would go ahead and be able to reduce our share of the greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, you all are probably pretty familiar with the huge health impacts that would come from that. Obviously, cases of asthma and bronchitis, heart disease and premature death, all things, emergency room, hospital visits. We have hundreds of thousands of missed work days, school days, and we've done calculations here that show there's over $10 billion in monetized health benefits that would come actually per year. That's a per year number that would come from implementing our AQMP. So with reducing those greenhouse gas emissions, that would also help reduce the possibility of dangerous wildfires and providing a more climate secure future. So this is more of a local voter opportunity. or basically for local control, and give the folks here on the local level the opportunity to decide whether or not they want to invest in air quality and funding issues through a ballot measure. That's what this enables. Now, I want to make clear though, that if you were to pass this bill, have it signed into law, and do nothing else after it, it would not raise a dime. So that's the key, is it's really just an authorization. A little bit more information about how the funding could be used. Again, this is, as the AQMP outlines, it's both for private and for public projects. So public entities and businesses are likely to receive a significant amount of funding, both at the regional level, but also individually. Funding would be available for public transit agencies, cities and counties, and for projects that effectively reduce emissions, like fleet turnover through deployment of clean vehicles and equipment. You might be purchasing zero-emission commuter buses or cleaner commuter trains, clean school buses, public solar projects. Another big key also is the construction of fueling and electric charging infrastructure on a grand scale, basically. So that would also obviously be creating jobs and reinvesting money into the local economy in order to build out all that infrastructure. The AQMP would provide the framework, for a spending plan, in a sense. That is a parameter. It says you need to do these things in order to meet the federal requirements for air quality. So there is basically a directive and a parameter within which you'd be working with any funding that would be raised. And that's basically to ensure that the money is spent effectively and with accountability. Just so you're aware, we've done our due diligence in terms of looking at the public response through public surveys. We did one as recently as January, here in 2019. Overall, there was support for incentives for clean vehicles, also for clean air funding measures. In LA County, for example, there was a 70%. Orange County was 57% support. San Bernardino County was 58% support, and Riverside County was 51% support, for an overall number for the South Coast region of 65%. And that's really just through a public survey with no education, no anything, just basically, reaching out to voters and see how they feel right now. And of course, our governing board is made up of local elected officials from all 4 counties and various cities as well. So they would have oversight and approve projects funded by any monies received through any initiative, and the folks would be on spending the money the right way. Basically, the authorization is primarily for something like a sales tax would be the funding type of measure that would be authorized through this bill. But it's important to note, this was discussed earlier today at our legislative committee, that we've gotten feedback from different stakeholders, and there's a lot of localities that are concerned about protecting their sales tax cap area. Basically, there's a sales tax cap. They want, if they have remaining space under that cap, they want to maintain it. So this bill has been drafted in a way that would be exempt from the cap and would not basically reduce in any way. It would still preserve existing tax cap space for the cities, the counties, transportation agencies, for their own use as well. And that's my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh boy, they're all raising. Let's see, who hasn't raised it? Eddie, you're the only one? Jeff? And John, why don't we start off? Okay. We'll start with Rochelle. Rochelle?
It's actually not a question. I just want to commend AQMD for taking this action. I know
Put your mic closer to.
I just wanted to commend AQMD for taking this action. As City Council, this really was a big issue for us as it relates to the caps and keeping taxes local as much as possible. We know there are many other entities that may not be taking this action, so to be able to be forward-thinking, to think about the district is much appreciated. Thank you to Mr. Delatorre for coming to our City Council meeting and addressing this issue, because again, I know this is very pressing for a lot of local municipalities.
Let's go with David.
Phil, thank you for the presentation. It's always very helpful. You referenced what happens if we don't attain and the penalties the region can incur. And with that in mind, I'm looking at the timing here as far as, first of all, you need to go and get the legislation passed. Then you'll need to go to the voters to get that passed. Then you're going to need to implement incentives to change out a lot of this mobile equipment, which is the primary source of the pollution we have to clean up. and I'll just make it easier to say, if we don't get the authorization we need and don't get the additional money you need to incentivize the transition to cleaner mobile equipment, we're not going to get to attainment and we're going to be imposed upon. And looking as far as the relevance of where the penalties would be imposed, essentially you have Section 185 fees that will go directly on major stationary sources. And since the problem's of mobile sources, and essentially you guys have been set up to deal with CARB's issue and EPA's issue, if you're not successful by doing everything in your power, which you're going above and beyond, my question really is, how are we going to deal with the stationary sources if you can't get there when you've done everything you can?
Well, do you mean if this were to, I mean, basically the goal here is to create a solution, a pathway to getting this solution done.
Well, Philip, he's saying what happens if we don't get there?
If you don't get
If we
there,
don't get
what's
there.
the consequence to stationary sources?
So I think you're right. You know, we'd have to start looking more at the stationary sources, but, you know, we've always said in the past, even if we were to shut down every single stationary source, we would not be able to meet attainment.
Correct.
So, you know, I don't want to start throwing things out there, but we'll have to start looking at innovative ways. I mean, we got to come into attainment one way or another.
Sure. And this is something, is last time this happened, Bill and I went with Barry to Washington, D.C. to try to change the provision in Clean Air Act or get something so it would be an equitable solution. If there are penalties, shouldn't the people at fault be penalized? If the stationary source is responsible for 10% of the problem, all right, maybe you proportion it. But why aren't mobile sources, or at least CARB and EPA, responsible for not controlling the sources under their control? You guys have gone above and beyond. You don't have the authority you need to control the pollution. You only have the direct regulatory authority for stationary sources. So I'm going to get it at whenever we know we're going to have a problem, to at least start addressing the inequity towards stationary sources if that happens.
So I think it's a great point. At the San Bernardino CTA meeting where I presented this item, Supervisor Rutherford had a great, you know, she understands the problem. She understands we have limited authority, but what she said was she challenged all the other cities and the other agencies that were there that go to Washington and tell them what we need the authority. Because if they're not willing to do it, give us that authority. They're not going to ever give up authority, but this is what she said. And you know, again, if there's a groundswell of people going to D.C. and letting their congressional members, their senators know, they're going to start listening, but they're not giving us the tools. And you know, we're caught between a rock and a hard place.
And maybe in that dialogue, if there's something where South Coast gets to the point of saying, you know, at this point we know we're not going to be in attainment, maybe that's a dialogue that needs to be had with anyone that could get you the authority that you need, and start discussing this with the people who can make a change.
And I would just add also that we have, you know, that's why we've been pursuing a national clean truck rule as well, trying to also look at a, you know, more even-handed, and so it's spread out throughout the country, but having some sort of regulation on mobile sources. Obviously, we fully agree that mobile sources are the real big elephant in the room that we need to address. So, you know, right now it's the carrot approach that really is going to hopefully get us there on a faster basis, and hopefully be able to alleviate any of the pressure on stationary sources. And that's an important, you know, way to go.
So if, you know, there's no guarantees. The EPA has already said they're going to look at the rule and see if they're going to adjust it. We want a 0.02, lower down to 0.02. We don't know what they're going to lower it to, or even if they're going to lower it at all. But even if they were to lower it, there's still a rulemaking process they got to go through, and it'll be after 2023, that first deadline. So.
Right. And usually those are phased in over years, so it's hard saying exactly when it would really have an impact. So.
Mr. Lamar.
Philip, I know that there are some in the room that fear a federal takeover of your regulatory authority and regulatory authority in the state of California. There are also some in the room that might find the current administration takeover by them rather appealing. So I just leave it at that. But in all seriousness, this transactions tax initiative, our members haven't really come out and ready to take a position because we have yet to see a bill. We've seen your attachment or whatever that is, or what I guess the district is proposing with respect to language, but it raises a lot of questions. We had a board meeting here about a week ago. There are a number of issues that we need answers, or certainly like to have answers. One, we couldn't see a sunset date on this. This is a tax, if it's passed, would go on ad infinitum. If the goal is to help bring us into attainment or be the catalyst that does bring us into attainment, then I feel that there should be, this tax should be tied to an attainment date, whether it's 2023 or 2031 or something like that, not go on forever, as many tax initiatives do, 20, 30 years or so on. So that's one issue. There's also should be strict adherence as far as the expenditure of money to federally mandated emission reductions. Again, what we've committed to in the AQMP or in the state SIP, and nothing else. The other is it should be, as I said, it should be tied to the AQMP, and not to other pet projects, if you will. And then certainly strict accountability. We'll be talking about billions of dollars. I think I've heard anything from $1 to $2 billion a year annually, depending on what you're going to ask for, and whether it's a half cent or a full cent or something like that. So the public needs to know how much is being attributed to a certain community's projects, whether it's San Bernardino or Los Angeles or one of the other communities, and what it's going to be used for, and what the benefit is to our coming into attainment will be, certainly in terms of emission reductions.
So Bill, let me answer your last one regarding communities. So as you know, pollution has no boundaries. So for us to identify communities to get the money, I think is we got to look at it from a bigger perspective, a more macro perspective. Is we can have a truck license in a certain community, but that truck is transversing our region and causing pollution across the region. So we can't, I don't know if we're going to be able to tie it to communities, number one.
Well, I think rather than, again, rather than tie it to a community, South Central LA or Boyle Heights or something like that, or city of San Bernardino. So rather than pour money into specific communities, then you need to go after heavy-duty trucks,
right?
Localized trucks, or electrification of the ports, or charging stations, or something like that.
That's all in the AQMP. Those types of projects,
right? Yeah, your control measures, CMBO 3 or something like that. And where those sources of emissions are, regardless of the community. And as you say, yes, at least CARB's new regulation on reporting criteria, pollutants, and toxics, they've erased the community boundaries, so that's statewide. And I also don't think that there should be community boundaries on this transactions tax if it is approved.
And then getting to the sunset date, it's not going to be in our bill. It's not in our bill, right? It's not in our bill. It'll be an initiative, more than likely, sunset date. But again, we're so far behind already, and what the AQP called for was an investment of $1 billion to $2 billion a year, and maybe we've met about, maybe 20% of that. We're still 80% behind every year. We don't get those monies, so it puts us that much far behind. Whether in fact we tie it to an attainment date, I agree. Obviously we don't need it beyond, once we meet attainment, we don't need it beyond that, but, we don't know. We're supposed to meet attainment. Obviously, we're going to miss 2023. More than likely, probably, very likely, we're going to miss the 2023 attainment date. But yeah, we missed 2010 exactly. So, but still, we need those monies to meet attainment. And if whatever that sunset date it is, or it's attainment, whatever it's going to say, we're obviously we don't need more. We don't want more money than what we need to meet attainment. And then, I'll real quick, Philip, and then. With regards to, you said something about the monies that's going to be used for. Is that what you? Yeah, I think you have an idea. It's going to be it's all in the AQMP. It's kind of, and we've heard from multiple stakeholders. They want a list, and looked at De Leon's bill that helped Measure M get on the ballot, and in there they actually had types of projects or the specific projects that it's going to pay for. That was a little bit different because that was a ballot measure. And what we're putting in is just an authorization to create a ballot measure. So,
but you can't ask a voter to go through the AQMP any time before they vote or any other time. I mean, that's
right. No, we'll make it.
Yeah.
It'll be written.
So I mean, when I say tie it to a project, and I also said that there has to be some sort of you're going to throw $1 million into a particular project. Now, what is the public going to get out of that in terms of emission reductions? That's something. You spend this much, you're going to get this back from it. And that's why it makes sense, and that's why you should check the yes box.
Absolutely.
But it's got to be very simple to the voter.
Right.
Totally agree.
And
go ahead.
Okay, I was just saying, obviously the difficulty there is because, as Derek just said, it's an authorization for a voting district. There's really no opportunity to create any kind of. It's not creating a measure that would have a sunset date. It's the step before that happens. And I think the bill that was being referenced, as Derek said, it's different. So they were saying, here's exactly what's in it. But so we can point to our AQMP. We can provide more succinct information to say these are the specific types of projects that will be funded. Again, it's a global solution. So all of these things have to be addressed in order for the entire region to meet attainment. So that means every county, even though it wouldn't be specific to a county, has to get its fair share in order for this all to work. And that's the whole point of this. That number that was created was the need for the entire region to handle all the different things that we'll need to do. And of course, accountability is something that's important because we need to make sure it's going to the right types of projects in order to get it done. But we appreciate your thoughts. We agree in terms of what needs to be shown on what it's being spent on and the effectiveness of it.
Phil, I like Junior's approach, the big picture, because that's really what it is, the big picture, because there's nothing really come out yet to analyze and divide, and everybody gets their share of this and that. So it's not here yet, and that's fair enough. So that's why I think a lot of these conversations are premature. But I'd like to know two things. One, if you could explain to me in a simple Simon method authorization. So that would be that the AQMD has authorized a measure to go to the legislature to turn around and be able to authorize some kind of taxation, whatever it might be, for a certain region. Is that basically correct?
Well, a county or a city, for example, has a voting situation set up where they can put something on a city ballot or a county ballot. So the South Coast Air District is a kind of all of Orange County and parts of 3 other counties. So you have to kind of establish that voting district, and that's what the authorization is. That includes setting up who's the elections officer, who would be helping you to actually run the ballot. So it's a lot of those logistical type of things.
Sure. And the second issue is, well, really a combination of the two because it's been answered. I really, really like the sunset provision. I really do. Two things. One, this double H, this homeless bond passed a year ago. I voted for it holding my nose. I really did, holding my nose. But because of the issues of what's out there and these homeless people, but it's got a 10-year sunset clause and it's gone. I like that because in 10 years, you can measure that. I'd like to be able to have a 10-year sunset clause, maybe a little longer, but not much more, here at AQMD with that. And I'd also like to tag along some of the bond committees that I've been on, some type of steering committee. The AQMD members, great, but also somebody that's non-elected, I'd say a citizen steering committee,
Oversight, how about
an
oversight?
oversight committee, correct, that will also be able to have input on the projects. So far, until something comes out, I mean, it's all premature right now, but still, just some input on what's coming around the corner.
Yeah, and I think is
Some of those things is going to be up to the governing board to determine, oversight committee.
Sure.
If in fact it does get to the ballot and passes.
Sure.
So you're right, we got a little ways to go, but we got to start thinking about that now because it comes up very quickly. I mean, literally, if this bill passes, becomes law probably in January 1, but it'll go on the ballot in November.
Right.
We'll start receiving funds if it passes, probably the second month of 2021.
Yeah, thank you, but I also would like to add, for the steering committee, I'd like to have at least one or two members of this group here be considered, if there's a consideration process. That's all, thank you.
That's all up to the board.
And I just wanted to echo what Derek was saying. Obviously, incentives, there's a limited time need for it in a sense because you incentivize something, it gets deployed and commercialized. But however, I would remind that there are, like I said, the 2038 date is the one that's farthest out there. So that's why, 10 years probably is not going to get us where we need to go in terms of fully funding the AQMP and addressing all the air quality needs.
Rita?
Yes, thank you, Philip, for the presentation. And Derek answered part of my question already. So what I think I'm hearing you say is that this is sort of step one in the process.
Yes.
So this is just to give you, the district, the authorization to even put a ballot, a measure on the ballot?
To create a district. So first thing we got to do, and whether it's by board or by voter-driven initiative, it to be put on the ballot. But first thing we got to do is create this district. There's no voting district for South Coast AQMD.
And will that change the composition of the board in any way? Like then, or you can keep the existing board, and then after you do this step, then you move on to put that measure on the ballot for the sales tax increase, right?
Again, whether it's our board or by voter-driven initiative.
Okay. So I appreciate that clarification. Then I had a couple of comments. I remember on the survey, when the details were disclosed, that the majority, I want to say something like in the 60% area, the majority of the people surveyed didn't even know who AQMD was. So I think we have to take the support with a grain of salt, because if you call me and ask me, do you want clean air? I'm going to say yes. So, I think I'm hearing some concerns from the cities and municipalities about, especially this is an additional sales tax increase proposal that would only impact the South Coast Basin. So there's definitely concern there. And then I wanted to echo some of the comments that David made about the stationary sources, which I'm a big proponent of the carrot approach, as the district staff well knows. But I'm concerned that the stationary sources at the end of the day get all the sticks and not enough carrots. One of the things that I had asked about was a presentation to this committee on the marine coatings rule that's coming up, and that's a perfect example of a rule that has no air quality benefit whatsoever, but it is putting in all these administrative burdens for businesses and small businesses that are a disincentive to modernizing and coming in with clean technologies. So there's definitely a concern here because the mobile sources are the culprits, and the ones that are putting out most of the pollution. And from the MATES presentation, we found out 2/3 of that is coming from the toxics perspective, is coming from diesel particulate matter, which has very little to do with stationary sources. But at the end of the day, if we don't meet attainment, then it's those stationary sources that get penalized. So just wanted, staff to be considering that as we move forward with some of these proposals that are controlled by staff. I mean, I can see the mobile source area, we have little control over that, but we can do some things in-house to help the stationary sources. Thank you.
So I don't think I ever said that we were going to start penalizing stationary sources. I think what I said was we're going to look at everything. We're going to look at everything if, in fact, we don't get this. And, Wayne has always said, we have controlled stationary sources almost as much as we could. There's a little bit room left, but even if we were to shut down all stationary sources, we will not meet attainment. And quite frankly, and I believe this, that if, in fact, this does pass the legislature and the voters vote for it, it takes away the pressure off of stationary sources. Not to say that we wouldn't still do our monitoring and stuff, but at least now we're looking at the mobile sources because that's the biggest contributor right now that we need to reduce to meet the ozone standard. So, but I don't know if we're going to penalize stationary. That's up to the board to determine, what we're going to do. I mean, staff makes recommendations, but it's up to the board in what direction we want to go.
And I would just add that for the survey, we got a reputable firm, FM3. They asked pretty specific questions. The ones relating to whether or not they know who the AQMD is or the EPA or those kinds of things were also very informative, but separate from the questions that were very directed as to what kind of funding measures they'd vote for or what types of purpose they'd want the money to go for. So there was pretty specific information that gives us confidence in the numbers that we told you about.
What I found interesting was they don't know us. The number they asked about AQMD, the number was really low. When you went to South Coast Air Quality Management District, the number was higher. So it's kind of interesting why they know us based on our full name and not the acronym. But that's all the questions over here, Supervisor. Oh, sorry, Eddie.
Mine's pretty easy. Throughout the state, are there other districts that have implemented this, and how has it worked for them?
So the only one I'm aware of is, and they really did not implement a sales tax, but Bay Area, when the law that created Bay Area Air Quality Management District, their legislation actually had a parcel tax attached to that. So Bay Area gets a lot of their revenue coming from the parcel tax. But other than that, I'm not aware unless Julie, but yeah. I mean, I can Measure M, Metro has done that, and there's no sunset. And, everybody who lives in LA County is going to be paying that on, forever. So, Paul?
I think a lot of it, too, is a perception side. With Metro and Measure R, you see these big trains and the tracks and people moving. So eventually you're going to go on the train, eventually, one day. Now, AQMD, I mean, it's still this amorphous thing, as Rita was saying. And even today, you ask people who AQMD is, there's a lot of the population that don't know. And the public relations people here at AQMD, they do a pretty decent job. Yeah, they really do. But still, it's an unknown factor to a lot of the citizens. So that's why I say that.
Businesses know us. The public doesn't know us. You're right. Yes, Rochelle.
Just a quick question. Are you sensing anyone that's opposing this? Are there groups that are opposing this effort?
So the voter authorization, it's kind of we kind of switched gears because I'm sure you all heard before it's going to be a sales tax. And we switched gears because of the feedback, as Phil mentioned, we got in Sacramento on the changes. You need to first do step one. I haven't heard of any opposition to it
Yeah,
yet.
opposition to creating a
city-
district.
To create the district? I mean, no, I mean, I think what the underlying message we're getting is, there's going to be a sales tax, and that's what they're opposed to.
Yeah, it's more related around the tax cap issue, or really, I mean, you have cities that are basically doing proactive sales tax measures just to reserve their spot, just to get funding even if they don't need it yet. But like I said, our language basically allows any existing tax cap space to remain and to be available to the localities and the agencies that want to pursue it.
So yes, and I get that piece of it. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, as a city council member, I do want to support it, and is there ways that we can help support it to get it authorized? And are there any entities that can assist in that so that it can move forward?
So we can't ask you for support. All we can do is educate, and it's up to the individual.
Okay, maybe more specific. Are there some associations that could possibly assist with this?
We've reached out. I mean, we've gone to like
Okay.
for your area, San Gabriel Valley COG. We've gone to the COGs. We've gone to the chambers, other things where we're members, and that's where if we're a member of the organization,
Although I
we
would,
can ask for support, right? That's what I.
well, no, we don't want to ask for support, but if they're offering support, I'm sure we wouldn't say no to that. So we can talk.
Derek? I just had one comment here, is that, as I said earlier, we haven't made up our minds yet on this. But I don't know if anybody here remembers the community redevelopment monies. Some communities, followed the rules and invested them the way they should have. Others, they weren't to pet projects, or they were mishandled. And I think if anybody, has a sense of history or civic history, they remember, that's the last thing that you want is to have a proposed tax measure with the kind of funds we're talking about, run the risk of being abused. So.
Well, I think, having not only, if the board does decide to have an oversight committee on this, but the board still, I would imagine, is going to be very active in this. So, I think, we've done a really good job on Carl Moyer, so we have already a track record of implementing these type of incentive programs. So there's should be no issues.
No, and I'm not pointing figures or anything at anybody. You're all honorable people, but I mean, it's with that much money, there's temptation there. So.
And I would just say that the thing that's always hanging over our heads to make sure that the money's spent the right way is avoiding the federal sanctions and meeting the federal requirements. So we have to do it right in order to avoid those big things.
Rita?
Yes, just if you could give me a quick clarification, because I thought I heard you say that at first you were coming in with a sales tax increase proposal, and then now you're moving away from that and having this voting district
I would just
proposal.
clarify that, I mean, the language, it was more of a assessment of what we're actually asking for. The language never fully did like what Measure R or Measure M. It never created a tax directly. It really was mostly, but I think the way we were presenting it was presuming to go to step 2 in a sense on messaging, but we were never actually really setting up any kind of tax itself. It was really always establishing a voting district, and we wanted to clarify that.
So what is the timeline for after you overcome this step? Then what happens next? Do you have a subsequent proposal, or do you have language in this proposal that spells it out?
For
What
the-
happens after this, if this were to get approved, the voting district proposal?
So either the board, as I mentioned earlier, either the board puts it on the ballot, I'm sorry, puts it on the ballot, or there's a voter-driven initiative. So whatever those, I would imagine it would go in the general election in 2020. So whatever the time frame is for that, that'll determine when and if there's a ballot measure.
But that ballot measure is still a sales tax increase, or is it another type of tax?
Yeah, it would be revolved around this, that kind of funding measure, only when authorized would be a sales tax.
Any other questions? None over here. Supervisor Perez?
Well, thank you once again for the presentation, and quite frankly, everyone around the table for all your questions. Those are all great questions. You know, sitting on the Ledge Committee, we are also reviewing this, and there was quite a bit of questions as well. I appreciate many of the points that were made, right? And clarification, quite frankly, to establish a voting district, not necessarily yet a tax. I guess we'll figure that out in the near future as we continue to move forward. Avoiding obviously the federal sanctions and penalties, funds to stay in the district, and making sure that those dollars are equitable to the areas. The tax cap that cities might be concerned with, the thought about a sunset clause, that's something perhaps to consider. Obviously ensuring that ultimately we don't have the same concern that we had back in the day with redevelopment agencies, and ensuring that there is oversight. And I also heard, I believe, who makes up that membership of that oversight, and perhaps folks from this committee here should also be part of that oversight committee. Those are all great points, folks, and I'm sure I missed a few, but just wanted to make sure that staff took note of all that, and as we move forward. With that said, written report number 6. Is there any type of, there aren't any actions here, but is there a brief report on that, or is that just receive and file?
Receive and file, sir.
Okay, thank you. And other matters, item number 7 from the body or its staff. Any points to be made or questions?
Rita has one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just following up on Rule 1106 marine coatings, I know that is coming up in April for said hearing, and I was wondering if this committee will have a chance to review that proposal.
And then just from staff, our annual Cesar Chavez event is taking place on Saturday, March 30th at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach. So if you're interested, there's flyers on the table over there. Take them, and if you'd like to attend, make sure you call up and RSVP, okay?
Any other business
Staff
from
update.
membership?
That's fine. We'll discuss it.
Not hearing none. Public comment period. Is there anybody there that'd like to make a public comment?
Harvey Etterwood.
Okay, thank you. Harvey, if you can limit your comments to less than 3 minutes, please.
Okay, I'm Harvey Etter. I'm speaking for myself and for the Public Solar Power Coalition and all those folks that think we need to convert to solar equitably as quickly as possible. Mobile sources above 15 and more vehicles are covered by the district. Now, what percentage of that, pardon? Oh, can you explain that? What? Only government fleets? Okay, well, I think that needs to be challenged, that you need to bring
This
it-
period
bring
is
it down
public
to
comment.
the
I
three
think you just
vehicles.
raised your points. We'll take note of that, Harvey, and then we'll get back to you as staff.
Okay, well, and there are other things that are going on. I think this group has to get involved with community choice and public solar power happening in the district now, and it's throughout the district. So I just attended the board meeting for the the Clean Power Alliance, which serves unincorporated areas of Los Angeles and Ventura counties and 29 cities. So it's happening. It's the 5th largest utility in the state. It's been around about a year, and this is what's happening in the future. It needs to be implemented and coordinated with future plans, which need to be solar environmental conversion plans, like the Solar Environmental New Deal via the Representative Cortez and was it Mackey, Senator? Is it Senator Markey? Markey. All right. So this is where the rubber meets the road, and it's not going to happen on its own. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment, Harvey. And seeing no other public comments, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone.